I had a customer ask me what ratio is a good ratio of how much you should spend on logging compared to their overall infra. And I don't know if there's like a specific ratio because it depends on what your needs are, but if you're spending more than 20% or more on logging, that's probably a sign that you probably want to take a look at what you actually are logging, whether you need it. If you're at like the 5%, 10% level, that sounds like it's pretty good to me from most people from what I've seen, but I've seen examples where logging was more expensive or almost more expensive than their compute itself, and that's definitely probably not optimal. So
That's a really good shout. I got, and that's a pretty common question. I like 10% logging is probably okay. I had a customer that was doing just over 26% logging, and I called it out. I was like, this is quite heavy. And it was a banking customer at financial industries. They had lots of reasons. Ultimately, the reasons were just poor discipline. Ultimately, from initial, so they just logged everything just in case because they were afraid of the financial auditing and inspections. And I ended up having discussions with the security team because, of course, everybody was like, "Oh, we need it for security." So I spoke to the security team. And they're like, "No, we don't need this level." And then it was like I was passed around the various teams, each thinking the other people needed it. We ended up saving them. We saved them $30K a month, unfortunately, for the amount they were spending, but it was a rounding error practically. They were still overspending on the logging by a fair old chunk, but it's knowing what good looks like and having an idea of it is, again, I think it's a blind spot, right? It's because if you don't know, you don't know. So maybe a quarter of your bill on logging is entirely valid, but in that case, it definitely was not.
It does sound excessive, but I wonder, can we break that down further? Should we have more or less logging in a dev or test environment than we do in a production environment?
See, that's exactly how we saved that $30K a month, right? So they put in some dev switches which turned off the excess logging in the lower level environments, and because they realized that you don't need it's in dev, you need some logging. You just don't need you don't need the same sort of logging you need in production. There's different kind of metrics, different kind of signals. So yeah, and that's the same for all monitoring. Honestly, if it's in lower level environments, you should be using more Spot. You should be using less monitoring, and you should be looking for the signals that are on the thing you've just tested should be really high debug level. But for the rest of it, it should just be turned right down because if it breaks, you just turn it off and on again. It's not going to have high impact in production. That's money making. And so a good rule of thumb I used to use was that if production plus pre-prod is costing more than everything else, wonder why. Because sure, you're doing development and R&D and innovation, sure. But if I had some cases where it was like 7 to 10 times more expensive for the non-production workloads. Like I pointed out to the customer, those workloads are not directly making you any money. So consider, is this really necessary? Do you need to have 3 replicas of an RDS database across multiple zones for a developer? Or can you turn that down when you're deploying it in the Terraform and maybe just save a little cash there? Because if you do that and you're at enough scale, then you can save a lot of money really quickly with no impact is the point. So I think these things are easily overlooked, and because ultimately, as a customer, you're just trying to shift features out to get them in front of paying customers as quickly as possible. So some of these smaller points are easily overlooked. So I don't think I advise people not to beat themselves up because they've missed it. It's a pretty common mistake, and just knowing where to look is the key aspect, I feel.
And I think also asking the right questions. Like you mentioned 2 situations, one of which teams weren't communicating with one another, and another situation where a team wasn't asking, do we need to be receiving metrics here every second?
Yeah, exactly. And so but then communication is clearly difficult because I've never gone to a customer and found that they've solved this as a problem. So again, we just have to accept that this is the real world. There's going to be bad communication. It's okay to be making these errors. It's just that having systems in place and mechanisms to be able to identify and spot them so we can then make sure that they don't get repeated and end up becoming very costly. It's okay to make mistakes. Just let's not make them too expensive. That's the phrasing I use.